This is the Young Collard Podcast, off-the-cuff conversations between three progressive pastors at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. I'm Todd Leonard. I'm senior pastor at Glendale City Church of Seventh-day Adventist. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Aaron van Voorhis, lead pastor at Central Avenue Church in Glendale, and by Linda Biswas, an associate pastor with the Vallejo Drive Church of Seventh-day Adventist, also in Glendale. Today we take a moment to talk about the tragic events that took place a couple weeks ago in Atlanta with the shootings at the local spas. As three pastors who grew up in fundamentalist congregations and denominations, we talk about how the sexual purity culture that permeates much of conservative Christianity, how that affected Robert Aaron Long, and how that affects so many people who grow up in conservative Christian culture. I hope you enjoy this conversation. All right, it's so great to be with you guys, especially because my two normal compadres ditched me this week. And so Aaron and Linda, I'm really glad that you're with the conversation today. And this conversation is close to my heart because the shooting that took place in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago by Robert Aaron Long, that's kind of my neck of the woods. I pastored a church in Woodstock, and I know where the neighborhood of Crabapple is, and I was in another church not too far away from the Cheshire Bridge area in Atlanta. So that whole horrific shooting, struck really close home to me. I also know that for the three of us, we're each, I think would say, recovering fundamentalist Christians who have seen a lot of the culture, and I think that we each have a good perspective that I think we can bring to the things that can come out of dysfunctional religion. I read this article from the Los Angeles Times, and in it, a terrorism expert from Georgia State University, Mia Bloom, she says that when you are faced with devastating, horrific events like this, people like clear and simple answers, but those answers wouldn't be honest. We need to be open to an intersectionality that killers can be racist, they can be misogynists, they can suffer from mental illness all at once. And I would add that the influences from their religious upbringing can have an influence as well. And I think that's where I just want to kind of kick off today and ask each of you, what was it for you that caught your attention?
Well, I know for me, I grew up in purity culture as a Pentecostal evangelical. So I grew up very conservative, fundamentalist, I would say. And I was part of, this was the 1990s when I was a teenager. And so I grew up kind of at the beginning of what was purity culture. And so I understand in my church, I'm the pastor of a church in Glendale. I understand the guilt, the self-hate, and the anxiety purity culture produces. It doesn't surprise me that somebody who has violent proclivities, I'll put it that way, might actually be triggered by something as toxic and as powerful as purity culture, and thereby scapegoat the objects of his obsession. In this case, it was Asian American women who were working at spas. But this is, to me, I when I saw this and as it came out that he grew up evangelical and he suffered from a lot of that purity culture guilt, for me, I just was like, oh, that's the idol of purity culture at work. And so, for me, that idol is pretty much comes from evangelicals projecting their anxieties about sexuality onto God and their patriarchal values onto God and their desire to control women's bodies, onto God. And so that's where my head went with it all.
When I first heard about it, as an Asian female, I know different Asian, Southern Asian, not East Asian, but still as an Asian female, I was on the bandwagon with everyone. Like, this is a gruesome and horrific thing. And just anger, right? I just had anger, not at him because he was male or that he was white or that he was a Christian. It was because he was a male and because he was white and because he was, and all of these things being also from a conservative background because of my heritage, but also because I grew up in the South in Tennessee, there are all of these things that play a role into what we're feeling. But then as I'm hearing articles or reading articles, or I'm hearing news reports going, it's not a hate crime, or what his church's response actually was, like removing themselves, going, this is solely on him, we had nothing to do with it. I was struck by a church who is supposed to be here to walk alongside someone in their spiritual development and in the rough stuff that's going on in their lives, going, we don't know him, we haven't seen him, like almost type of thing. That struck me as part of the conversation that's happening.
It rang true for me that he would turn his frustration with himself and he would place it out on other people. And that he would take the very group of people that he would go to, whatever he would do when he would frequent those spas, that was part of his, that wasn't simply a massage for him. Like you said, Linda, I think when people were saying, oh, it's not a hate crime, this is a guy it's his own internal stuff. Well, no, he manifested it outwardly, right, towards a specific race and gender of people.
I was struck, Linda, as you well pointed out, I too was struck by the church's reaction and just some of the language they use. They use the term, we decided he was not a regenerate believer.
Yeah.
And therefore he was ousted from the rolls and cut off from the community. But that language, we decided, we got together in a meeting and decided he was not a regenerate believer. And then some other language in there, which if you grew up in the church, and specifically in conservative, this was a Baptist church, I think, whatever, conservative evangelical traditions, that kind of language can tell you a lot about the worldview of that community. And it's obviously a very toxic kind of worldview, in my opinion, driven by, theologies that otherize everybody else and that are inherently, endemically, frankly, I think white supremacist and patriarchal and anti-gay and probably anti-science, and driven by a lot of anxiety and a lot of, guilt and shame and self-hate and the need for, to just, basically just, there's this idol God, right? And all that stuff. And there's just so much about it that was so unhealthy. It was so triggering for me to read. I was like, I'm surprised there's not more guys coming out of the church like him. And there, frankly, maybe there are, we just don't hear about it. I'm not talking about shooters, but guys that are violent towards women, guys that are, abusive personalities, frankly, because they grew up in this stuff. And I've met enough, frankly, white male pastors, and Todd, you're an exception, that are just, basically assholes and very entitled and driven by this ego that is this God-given ego, and it frankly translates into abusive relationships and manipulation. So I'm saying that what he did, going and shooting, was obviously an aberration in some ways, but in other ways it wasn't. That was very, very white male and Christian of him to do, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, it was so interesting that the church, in their statement, right, because they posted a statement on their homepage, using that language and throwing up a scripture text to reinforce what they were saying. I was like, ugh! Like, it wasn't enough just to say it. Let's prove to you where we're saying it from. And I was like, friends, you just threw your entire church under the bus, because how did you just choose this one? I mean, yes, heinous crime, but according to your text, there's a couple other people that might fall under it. But it's so interesting, Aaron, that you're saying it's you're not surprised at this being a white male Christian mentality that's happening. I've read a couple of things about how, purity culture in the church, everyone everyone does it differently. I don't know what the guys do, but I know for girls, we have like the chastity rings, right? Like some people still do the ceremonies where
worse
they
for
sign
girls.
a thing with their dad going, I promise dad, I'm not going to have any sexual.
Creepy.
I don't know. What do the guys go through? Do you have
Well,
things
it's 10 times worse for the girls. Let me just say, I don't mean to, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's 10 times worse. It was yesterday we talked about this at church, and one of our female staff members talked about how she went to a conference. Her father or her parents, maybe it might have been her mom or her dad or both, took her to an actual True Love Waits conference, and she looked around the room. It was like 1,000 other teenage girls. She was like, I don't remember seeing any boys there. She, of course, got the ring and had to sign a contract. And that contract, where basically she committed to, like, you know, be celibate. I don't know exactly what was on it, but she said that chastity contract was framed and put on their living room wall. Yeah. It wasn't put on her bedroom wall. It was put on the living room wall, so that everybody could see it when they came over. Like, oh, I'm so glad to see that, you know, her sexual organs are not going to be touched until she is properly wedded or something. You know, it's bizarre.
Well, not only is it on the wall, it's on her hand.
Yeah.
Like,
so, but it's, go ahead.
Around with this physical reminder that I promise God and my Father here at home that I'm not going to mess up. And any misthought, any misdeed, it's like an like you feel it, like it's a gut punch. So I wonder, and sorry, Aaron, also for interrupting you. Like,
not at all.
How much guilt has the church and the way that we've shared the gospel or the meaning of loving our neighbor impacted Robert Long? Like, how much responsibility actually lies with us? And then how, you know, because did we as the church have something to do with this? And what's our responsibility now? Is it supposed to be hands off, or are we supposed to run in going, we're not done with you yet? Let's keep talking, right? I didn't hear anyone talking about that yet.
Yeah.
No, the whole desire of the conservative Christian church is to keep saying that the mythology that we have been communicating to you about how you can be victorious over all these things is true. And when it comes out that somebody in our culture isn't victorious, well, then they're unregenerate and they never really had a relationship with Christ. And so it's never these things are never a referendum on the conservative Christian church. It's always on the individual who screwed up. And so you keep having the true love waits things and the daddy-daughter purity balls. And for guys, no, it, like Aaron said, it's much worse for the women because you do this stuff publicly. For guys, you know, there might be Bible study groups where the men's group might talk about how to stay as a pure man and talk about struggling with self-discipline and things like that. You know, I went to Bible college in Tennessee, and I remember going to a worship where a man came in and did a whole sermon just to the guys. This is like the only time it was like a public shaming thing for the guys, where he told the guys that, you know, you can't masturbate, you know, you can't do that. And he says, I'll meet with you afterwards. But, you know, that just sent 600 guys, all in their late teens and early 20s, full of sexual vigor. You know, it just sent everybody into this, you know, this shame, this self-hatred that that God can't give me the victory over this thing surging within me at this age.
And can I speak to that just for a second? Ironically, that commandment to repress actually backfires and actually creates more desire and actually creates acting out, right? So the irony, if you want to put it that way, is that in being taught to repress, like they never actually think about, from a kind of psychological point of view, how is all of that actually generating more desire or actually going to work out in ways that maybe are really unhealthy in these kids' lives and these adult lives? You know, suddenly, you know, all this repressed sexuality is translated into, you know, an addiction perhaps, or into getting into an unhealthy marriage at the age of 20 or 19 because
Right.
you're taught, you can't have sex before you're married, so you got to get married now. And suddenly you're a kid getting married and you're in your 40s wondering, who is this person I'm no longer this person anymore. I see this all the time. And frankly, even, my own wife and I got married when I was 27 to her and she was 21, but we both grew up, we were both celibate before we were married. And,
Yep.
we luckily have kind of journeyed together in our deconstruction, but that doesn't always work. And you end up in these marriages where you're kind of like, I got married when I was a kid, but I'm no longer that person anymore. And so purity culture creates failed marriages. It actually generates the very thing it's trying to repress. And, I'm just, going off now, but, it's a mess and it's toxic in ways that we don't even know.
Yeah, it's so interesting. His roommate, there are a couple of quotes from his old roommate Tyler saying that he could see how torn up he was about it, because every time he relapsed, he would go like, I'm failing as a Christian, right? And he would mention this to the roommates, and there were things, from different articles. I'm not sure if they're all accurate or not, but his roommate had mentioned that he actually had a flip phone versus a smartphone so that he couldn't stream porn on his phone, or that he actually came up to the roommates and asked them to take his computer one day, even though he'd put filters on so he couldn't watch things. And as I read all these things, I was like, man, he's having a trigger action negative, like everything in his life, like every time he had a thought, and you can have thousands of thoughts a day, right? Thousands of sexual thoughts a day. And if every time he was thinking something, it became I am failing God and I'm no longer worthy. Every time you have one of these things, what does it do to someone? And then he also, I was hearing he was seeking out treatment at Hope Quest or something like that. That's near the first spot where the shooting occurred, for an addiction program. It's a Christian run organization for counseling on how to do it. So if he's doing all of these steps, yet he was still, because of purity culture, going, you're not good enough every time you mess up. I was a college chaplain for over a decade, going, man, what have we been saying to these guys and where are they now? And what could we be saying differently to them so that they're not at this place where they're needing to check in, or where they're trying to commit suicide, or where they're being abusive to females? Like, how do we change that culture? And same thing for the females as well, because I had females who went, I messed up once, it's over.
There was an article that I read by a sociologist who said that when you study and you ask men if they have sex addiction, conservative Christian men are much more likely to say they have sex addiction than men who are, liberal Christians or not Christian at all, not religious. Even though when they would also ask the frequency of viewing porn or engaging in other sexual activities, the conservative Christian men were engaging in those activities much less than the ones, but the ones who didn't define themselves as sexually addicted, or who were doing it more, didn't say they were sexually addicted. It was, for them, it was normal. And whether or not we would say that their behavior was healthy, what we can see is that because of this purity culture mindset that has been so prevalent in the conservative Christian church, is what we've said. I will say this: what we've said is that normal behavior in your teens and 20s related to sex, we've turned into abnormal, aberrant, immoral behavior. And if we had instead talked about how to live as a healthy sexual being, and what that looks like in your teens, when your hormones are surging through you, and your 20s when you're still very much vigorous, and it continues for, what does that look like for somebody? And please don't put up a 60 or 70-year-old person talking about controlling your sexual desires to teens and 20 somethings and say like you can do it.
One of the things I think you're saying that I'm hearing is we need a better sexual ethic coming from the church. And I have attempted to articulate one at Central, and it's basically the same ethic I have about everything else, which is, we must ask ourselves, no matter what we're doing, what's best for human well-being, what's best for human flourishing. What are we doing, and is it really healthy and good for our well-being and the well-being of others that are involved? And that's really the only question that matters. Is this enhancing human flourishing or detracting from it? Is it enhancing our well-being or detracting from it? And that's not just a sexual ethic, but that's just a general ethic. And that's how I approach this now. And and frankly, people answer that question differently. What is healthy for one person sexually might not feel healthy for somebody else, or for one relationship might not be healthy in another relationship, because everybody's different. But people hear that, especially folks coming out of evangelical traditions and into a place like Central, and they're like, so what, everything just goes now? And I'm like, well, according to Paul, everything is permissible, but not all things are beneficial, right? This is the freedom we have in Christ from the law. So the religious law we are set free from. Not all things are beneficial. Everything's permissible, but not all things are beneficial. Therefore, what's the question? The question is, what does love actually look like? What is good for human well-being, my well-being, and your well-being? And that's the Christian question. That's the Christ question here for me. And so people say, well, does everything go now? And I'm like, no, not everything goes, because anything that's not love doesn't go. So it's not moral relativism. It's quite the opposite. It's asking ourselves, again, having these ethical standards by asking ourselves tough questions. And the answers look different in every context. What does well-being look like in my relationship with this person that I'm dating, or this person I'm married to? And everybody's going to answer that differently. So that's where I'm at with sexual ethics, or ethics in general, as a pastor or as a Christian.
Yeah, I had the opportunity to take a really unique course in seminary, and it was theology according to sexuality, or sexuality in theology. And in the course, we actually took the time to trace back where these standards in our church today come from. Like, where did they start? Which of the original founders of the church did it, and looking at the Bible and as we kept taking it, like, here's what it says today. Well, it came from this tradition. Well, it came from and we went back. A lot of it came back to ownership.
Yes.
Ownership in the Bible. A female belonged to her father until she was married. And if she did anything before she was married, then she has ruined that marriage sale contract to her husband, right? And things like that. And this is where the onset of, am I worthy, am I good enough, comes from. Am I ready for this? Am I ready for this union? Am I still good? And for the male and for the female. And I think if we bring it back to today, understanding ownership of your own body, like, you don't belong to someone else, you belong to you first, right? You belong to God first, like your body is a temple, right? And understanding what respecting yourself means. And then if we couple it, Todd said it as well, and my professor had said it, what if we took time to reimagine and redefine our levels of sexuality in a developmental time frame? When you are 0, when you are 2 and you're discovering your body, is that okay? When you are a teen and discovering your body, is that okay? When you are, right?
Yeah.
And where is it healthy and where is it not healthy? Brings into Aaron's thing. Is it good now? Is this part of loving myself and or loving others, right? And what if we looked at it in a developmental way? And can you imagine if we did that as a church? Like, what would teens say if we're like, hey, let's come talk about this? And it's the cool thing and it's the in thing, not the hush hush thing we're doing.
Right.
Brightly lit Friday night meeting, right? With where everyone's been fingerprinted. But it's part of our culture where, hey, let's actually talk about these things. And we call you ours anyway if you're going through stuff. I don't know.
Well, when I was the associate pastor at the church here at Linda, I did a Friday night youth group where I talked about how to have good sex.
That's awesome.
And the kids had no idea what to do with that because all they're supposed, and frankly, I think Christians have grown up in such a way now that, in fact, you don't know what to do with somebody who would talk positively about sex. If you're going to talk about sex in church, it's got to be about how horrible it is and how dangerous it is and how it's going to destroy you and how God is so ashamed at you. And isn't it ironic that because the Christian church has made sex the most shameful, horrible thing that anybody can engage in, unless you're in a heterosexual marriage, that there's all sorts of domestic violence that takes place as a result of people not knowing how to engage healthfully in intimate relationships, and then people or create fetishes around certain types of people in order to fulfill dysfunctional needs because nobody ever talked about it positively as a great thing to do and a really wonderful part of life that enhances and brings great joy to you.
You just mentioned the word fetish, and that's the perfect word. The church has fetishized sex. I mean, really, by its prohibitions and the repressive language, that is actually a way of fetishizing sex, and purity culture fetishizes it by saying it's and to fetish. A fetish isn't necessarily like a sexual obsession, even though that's often translated into it in our culture. But really, it just means ascribing magical powers to inanimate objects. An idol is a fetish, and so what we've done with sex in the church is we've said it's basically magic. And that, if you have sex with somebody before you're married, supernatural things happen to you whereby you are cut off from God, or that God can't bless your life anymore because you're now damaged goods. That's women are often told that, right? But it's this fetishizing of sex. It's this magical treatment of sex that ironically is actually what creates all of the acting out and all of the obsession and the sex addiction or the abusive nature of sex in the church, and the way that pastors, unfortunately, are often guilty of sexual improprieties because sex is so fetishized. My wife used to watch that show, 21 Kids and Counting, the Duggars on TLC, that family, the Fundamentals family in Arkansas, and you come to find out that one of the boys in the family, it turns out he was molesting multiple of his sisters. And when I heard of that, obviously that is just unbelievably awful and sad. But I was just thinking, like, when you grow up in an environment where sex is so fetishized and it's so like, the message you're constantly hearing. I mean, they were taught you can't even wear certain clothes because you're going to spark sexual obsession in somebody. And so girls, you got to wear dresses on. Their whole lives were ordered around sexuality. And the appearance is, of course, that, oh no, this is a family that doesn't think about sex. This is a family that isn't sexual at all. No, actually, they're obsessed with sex. They are absolutely obsessed with it. And it should not surprise us that there's unhealthy acting out even among the children, because the unconscious message they're constantly hearing is sex is magical, sex is everything, sex, 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 sex. And it's just bizarre that people don't actually see that as what's going on in the church. Anyway, it's fetishized.
And it's so interesting because when we set it up like that, one day you too will experience this.
Yeah.
One day, just wait, it's gonna be great. And then all of your friends or whatever, and they're like, yeah, it was, and then you're like, it's just so interesting, the psychology as well, Aaron, you'd mentioned that, because we know if you tell an 8-year-old not till we eat the cookie that you
Right.
left on the table.
That's right.
We're gonna sit there going,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
we've almost like challenged them. Like, what are they gonna do? Right?
Yeah, right.
Thing. It's so interesting. Yeah.
And let's be honest, sex is great, but it was overhyped. And
It's not everything.
Yeah, it's not everything. And I remember when I first got married and being like, so this is what it was all about. I mean, it was kind of like, I won't get too graphic about that, but it was almost just like there was a bit of a letdown. You're like, I thought, fireworks and bells and all this stuff, and it's kind of like, it's sex. It's the sex, and it's not. It's great, but it's not like the thing. It's not. You know what I mean? Anyway,
It's like
maybe that's just me.
No, it's like getting your favorite meal. It's like getting it's good home cooking. It's like, oh man, this is but then you get full, and then it's like the last thing you want is more cooking. And it's like, but that's the thing is, if we just talked about it, it's like a normal part of, it's like going out with your friends. It's like going to a football game. It's like these things about life. They all contribute.
That you were using stuffing, eating too much. Favorite football game, guys. Whoa, what's happening right now? Okay, I'm gonna bring it in from a different perspective. Linda is still unmarried and has abstained, and I will tell you, sex is always in my head. And I will, like, let me just be honest, like, this is a really hard thing, especially because I'm a pastor of a church and I'm not supposed to have these thoughts, and I will tell you, when I hit a certain age and when my girlfriends from college got me a dirty book for my birthday.
Yeah.
I was like, like, what do I do? And these adult friends of mine, as an adult, were like, listen, woman, you need to practice what you preach. And if you want to be honest to others, be honest for yourself first as well. And I was like, I am going to hell. How do I turn it on? It's 2021 and we're still in this culture where what do we do? What do I tell these single young adults that I know are engaging? I, as a pastor, I'm still on that bridge, especially because a lot of the things that I believe are not the things that my faith tradition believe, or I do not exactly believe how, so I'm still struggling with that line of how do we be different? How do we share and help you be the healthy person and live that life abundant that we want you to live?
Yeah. And I'm going to throw this out for churches that are wanting to give kids a healthier, like, sex education, and then it's designed for both for early adolescence and late adolescence, is something that's been put out by the Unitarian Universalists. It's called Our Whole Lives, or OWL for short, and it's a curriculum that helps kids understand themselves and how they are made and how they are intended to be. And I've talked about that with youth leaders in the past at our church. They're the ones that I've talked to. They're not currently our leaders, but even our leaders were so scared to have these conversations because they're so uncomfortable talking about sex because they grew up in a church that you didn't talk about it. And it's so hard to change a culture where it's normal to talk about it publicly, and it's okay. I've told people this, but people look back at me and they roll their eyes. They said, I want to be the sex church. I want to be the church that people want to come to learn about sex. I mean, I would love to be that place, because we have quality training that really helps people have a dignity about themselves, and understands how to love others, not to turn them into objects, not to fetishize them, but to consider it that sexuality is part of that loving one another like anything else. And I just feel like it's so hard to get to that place.
It's so interesting that schools get to have a say and a role in education. Obviously, the home gets a role, but the church, you know, this triad of homeschool, church, places where learning happens, right? Or professional learning should be happening, is the place that has just been the no. It's not been a place of education. I would love that. Like, how awesome. Like, I have questions. Let me go actually ask my pastor.
After we concluded our conversation, Linda wanted to share one more thing that she hoped wouldn't get lost in the conversation that we had today.
As Todd and I were reflecting here, it just occurred to me, and it's really important that we say this. We as a church, we as individuals, do not condone or excuse the behavior that happened. What Robert did is horrific and is not okay. And it is all of our responsibilities to own up to the things that we do.
Thanks for listening. We'd love to get your feedback. Please email us at uncollaredpodcast@gmail.com. You can find Uncollared Podcast anywhere you download your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also watch the podcast on YouTube. Please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.